Welcome to Between Two Chairs, Demystifying Commercial Real Estate, the podcast that brings you the latest insights and trends on the South Florida commercial real estate market, with your hosts, Fernando Arencibia Jr. and Jennifer Woolman. In each episode, we dive into the world of commercial real estate and break down complex concepts to make them accessible for everyone. Whether you're a real estate professional, a curious investor, or just interested in the South Florida market in general, Between Two Chairs is the podcast for you. So pull up a chair and join us.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Between Two Chairs. My name is Fernando Arencibia Jr., and with me, as always, is the ever vindictive Jennifer Woolman. Dun, dun, dun.
Vindictive? What did I do?
I don't know. I just felt like, we should have a little bit of soap opera.
Vindictive. Oh, my gosh. I sound horrible.
We just got to add a little drama.
Yeah, I feel like I got to be one of those people in those evening dramas like Dallas or Dynasty.
Exactly. Correct.
Oh, no.
There you go.
That's so not me.
Who shot JR? It was probably Jennifer. Boy, we're really dating ourselves, by the way.
I know. It's okay.
All right, everybody.
It's okay.
So today we're going to get a little bit in the business, right? And we're going to speak about compensation agreements between landlords and tenant reps. And, the reason why we want to break it down is because there are different paths into commercial real estate. There are those that start in commercial real estate from the very beginning, and there are many who start in residential and then they transition to commercial, and they're always surprised by a few of the differences. What occurs when you are a tenant rep in whether it's a retail location or an office or an industrial warehouse is that during the negotiations you have an expectation of what your compensation is going to be, but that is never really finalized between the landlord and the broker until the very end. It's usually at the time in which you're having a back and forth in the lease construction and in the lease editing that you begin to receive a compensation agreement between landlord and broker for how a tenant rep is going to be compensated for that work. And that often surprises people, right? Because it is not something that you will see in a residential transaction.
Correct. Although I think the residential transaction is changing a lot more to be much more like the commercial brokerage side based on the outcome of the lawsuit. But so this agreement details the compensation a landlord or a landlord's broker is going to pay a tenant rep and the conditions under which they'll pay it. And it's different from a buyer or tenant rep agreement, which is a contract that exists between the buyer and their tenant rep or broker. And that could also address compensation, right? Because a buyer, an exclusive buyer rep, might be getting paid by the tenant if the landlord doesn't compensate the rep. So they're two totally separate agreements, and again, they can come from the landlord or they could come from the landlord's broker.
Right. Yeah, and we don't want to confuse by saying buyer, right? But basically, those that are representing tenants, and as always, compensation and are always negotiable. They've always been negotiable, and I think that has always been clear in the commercial world. And who compensates the broker for the work is also up for conversation, right? It's always negotiable. But these agreements have been very commonplace in the marketplace, when you are dealing with tenant reps and as a tenant rep. And I find that it is much more structured and organized when you are dealing with a big landlord, right? More of a corporate landlord or a REIT or a management company that is managing for it. So there's a lot more structure there than when you're looking at a small shopping center that might be 7,500 square feet, might have 5 spaces, 5 units, and it might be a mom and pop that owns it. But there are items in the compensation, broker landlord agreement that are very valuable to both sides, right? Because there's clarity about who the person is, who do you represent, what the compensation is, how you're going to get paid, but also you're making certain claims, right? You're from a tenant side, you're making the claim that, hey, I'm the only person representing this company. And you are basically aligning yourself to say that if somebody comes and says, no, I'm the person that was representing, that you're making a commitment to defend, right, that claim.
Correct. And we have had an issue where we actually represented a landlord, and a tenant rep brought a tenant to see the space, and the tenant loved the space and said, I'm ready to do an LOI. And when we were waiting for the LOI, and we found out that that tenant had an exclusive tenant rep agreement with somebody else. So it does become an issue. So it's always good. Yeah. That's why the landlord is very good at protecting themselves and covering, because in that case, as soon as the original tenant rep found out, they graciously bowed out and was like, we didn't know that they had an exclusive, so they bowed out. But if they hadn't found out and they had gone ahead with it, then technically, there's two people that had right to compensation, which isn't good for the landlord, but it also would have hurt the tenant, right? Depending on what he had signed with his exclusive agency. And under that agreement, that tenant probably would have had to pay the commission. So that's why these are super, super important to have. They not only protect you, they protect, as much as possible, the tenant and the landlord as well if there is a dispute. From an agency standpoint, they vary, just like landlords vary. Every single agreement is different, but they should at least include the fact that the person being compensated has a valid Florida real estate license, because yes, you do need to have a license to get a commission, a real estate license in the state of Florida, that the person signing the agreement has authority. In most cases, it is the broker, because the compensation gets paid to the broker, but sometimes the broker gives authority to the agents and associates and affiliates that work with them. And then obviously how they're paid, under what condition they're paid, and anything else that might come up is usually thrown in as a catch phrase. But one of the things that you and I have discussed a lot is, commission agreements, especially nowadays where so many of our leases are being done on a triple net basis, whether the services and the commission are paid on the gross aggregate rental schedule, or are they paid on the net? Right. So that's really important, because there is a difference, obviously, in terms of what you get commission on.
Break that down just to get to the basics. So I would love for our listener to put themselves in the shoes of owning commercial real estate, and let's say that you own a shopping center, and now you're going to lease out a corner, 5,000 square feet, and you have found a great tenant. When you advertise for that space, you're going to advertise on what is the base rent that you are looking for the space. And let's say that, for the sake of argument, is $26 a square foot. But if you're going to rent it as triple net, then you're going to pass to the tenant the expenses that are prorated to that 5,000 square feet. So if it's a 50,000 square foot shopping center and I'm renting 5,000 square feet, then that's 10% of the whole. And so if my total expenses are X amount, then what I am expecting is for the tenant to pay 10% of those expenses. And those things are usually very clearly enumerated. It's going to be taxes, insurance, some common area maintenance. Everything is going to be bogged in, and it's going to come down to a number. Let's say that number is $9 a square foot. So now the tenant is going to pay the base rent of $26 a square foot, plus they're going to pay what we commonly refer to as CAM for $9, or pass-throughs. People interchangeably use some of these terms. So in total, the tenant is going to pay the landlord $35 a square foot. So what Jennifer is referring to is that there are landlords that will only pay or compensate the landlord rep or the tenant rep for the base rent, right? The $26 a square foot that the tenant is going to pay.
Plus the annual escalations.
Plus the annual escalations, right?
On the base rent.
On the base rent, and only on the base rent. There are landlords that will pay you not only on the $26 in this example, but will also pay you on the CAM, the $9. And so the argument is, the landlords who say I will only pay on the base rent, is that why would I pay for something that is an expense? It's not really revenue that is coming to me. The argument on the other side of it is that the tenant is not only paying base rent, but they're also covering the expense of the building. And so you as the tenant rep have brought to the landlord someone that is not only going to pay him the base rent, but it's going to pay him for that expense. So you procured the ability for the landlord to not only make the money on the base rent, but also cover their expenses. And so therefore, you should be compensated for the total amount that the tenant is going to pay to the landlord. And that's a little bit of a debate. You and I have had that debate,
right.
And it's not black and white, like everything in commercial real estate, and like we mentioned, everything is negotiable, but it does merit a conversation, right, about who is right. Is the landlord right, the one who only pays on the base rent, or is the landlord right, the one who pays on the whole? I'll tell you what, I want to work with it. I mean, I will work with all landlords, right? But I feel very much valued when I'm working with a landlord that will compensate me on the whole, because ultimately I am bringing them a quality tenant that is going to be there for years, and that is going to, help him cover expenses and still help him, make the return that he's looking for out of that commercial investment vehicle. Jennifer is smiling because this is like a never-ending debate, and I love that about it, because I too can fall on both sides of the debate. And once you sit on the side of the investment, I do understand that. Yeah.
No, but let's be perfectly clear. I will happily take, payment and commissions on triple nets. I don't want to say that. No.
No.
But I just, I usually don't argue that too much.
What I also find, especially those that are entering commercial for the first time, is if you are leasing, an apartment unit, and you're usually going to get paid at signing. So the lease gets signed, and you're going to be compensated whatever was negotiated and whatever was agreed upon. In here, it's a little bit of a longer approach, right? And again, there is no one way to do this, but usually you get a percentage when the lease gets signed, and deposits are made. But oftentimes, as it is the case, these units are not immediately going to be occupied by the tenant. They require work. You need to do a build out of the space to make it be what it is that you want it to be, especially in retail and things of that nature. And so oftentimes what the landlord will say is, we will compensate you the other percentage once, and they'll usually say, they'll do it in tiers. It's an if then approach, right? So, once the build out is completed and the tenant is moved in and the first payment is made, you'll get paid. Or it could just be, once the latter of the two, once the tenant improvements are completed and they get the certificate of use and they move in, it could be a variety of things, but usually everything is tiered, which is why some of our transactions last years. You're laughing because you've had one of the longest ones ever.
The longest ones ever. Yeah. And the other thing is that they also address, and this is why, as Fernando pointed out at the beginning of this episode, that oftentimes this agreement between the landlord and the tenant rep comes in later in the game, is because a lot of how we as tenant reps get compensated is based on the terms of the lease. So for example, if there's a cancellation clause in the lease, some landlords will tie your commission to that cancellation clause. So if it's a 5-year lease, but the tenant can get out after 3 years, let's say, with notice and no penalty, then the landlord might say, okay, I'm only paying you the commissions. However, we tier it, a portion upon lease signing and a portion on move-in for the initial 3 years. And then if they don't break the lease, then we'll pay you the commission on the remaining 2, right? And if there is a penalty for cancellation, then usually they're okay paying you your full commission. However, it's tiered, between signing and move-in of the tenant, because they'll just work that commission into whatever penalty and for tenant improvements and everything else that they need covered by the tenant in order to allow the tenant to break the lease. The same thing is true for if there's a clause in the lease for renewals or extensions or expansions, because most leases and most agreements will only pay for the initial 10 years. If it's a 10-year lease, they're not going to pay beyond 10 years. And then they'll have certain language under what circumstances do you get paid for a renewal or an expansion or an extension. You know, some of them won't pay anything. Some will pay a small percentage. For some, you have to prove that you were involved or actually be involved in the renegotiation of the renewal, extension, or expansion. So those are all things that don't come up at the very, very beginning of a lease. So if you are a tenant rep and you do get a very generic landlord tenant rep agreement, just make sure that it is in line with what your tenant is paying in the lease, so that if it says we're only going to pay you for the first 3 years, in my previous example where it was a 5-year lease and they could break it at the 3rd year, but there is a penalty for breaking the lease, then make sure that you're paid the full 5-year amount. Yeah. So those are just the kind of things to look at and compare it to the lease. We always say in commercial, you're constantly comparing one document to another. So you're always making sure that whatever's in the LOI carries over to the lease. You're always making sure that's what's in the lease carries over to any agreements between the landlord rep, if you're a landlord rep, and your commission, and the tenant rep, agreement. So.
No, without a doubt. What I often find interesting, as in, everything in commercial real estate, is that there is no two agreements are ever the same.
Ever.
Mm-hmm. And so, and it's just par for the course. This is how we, transact in commercial real estate when it comes to leasing. I do find that most landlords will find the value in compensating brokers, because there are always a lot of moving parts, and it's important to maintain everyone engaged throughout the process and to make sure that you overcome a lot of the issues that come up. And some of those issues come up after lease signing, and they have to do with even build out considerations. There are so many moving factors when it comes to that. It's not just that I'm going to rent an office space of 10,000 square feet and I'm going to be able to put everybody in there that I want to put in there. I mean, there are local ordinance requirements about how occupancy, and that has a lot to do with the way that things are built out. And so there's so many intricacies. Yeah, parking. I had a tenant, and it was kind of their first time going through this process, and they were surprised that they could not get their certificate of use until the furniture was in the place. And they were like, well, what does the furniture have to do with my occupancy? I said, well, that's the way that the county is able to determine whether, you're going to have, obviously, if you have a lot of extra seats and a lot of extra doors and a lot of, and the ingress and egress and all those stuff, they really won't know until all the furniture is in. And so
if the space is for 5 people and they come in and there's 30 cubicles, you have a problem.
Exactly. Correct. Exactly. That's right. Yeah, I find that this is one of those things, a little bit like in the movie, A Few Good Men, when they have this corporal on the stand and they ask him, where in the manual does it say where to go get your meals? And he goes like, no, it's nowhere in the manual. And he goes, well, are you telling me that in all your years in the service, you've never had, you've never been served a meal? And he goes, no, 3 rations a day, sir, And he goes, well, what did you do? I said, well, I just followed the line during chow time, And I think that that's a little bit of this too. Like, there are things in commercial real estate, in the transaction, where you only learn it as you're doing it. And that's kind of, for me, it's part of the fun too, is that there are so many things that I learned just in the middle of a transaction. Right. There's so much aspect of it, and this is just another aspect of it, and we wanted to kind of bring it to you so that we can, answer any questions that you have. I will say one thing, and it's really not the topic of the podcast, but I think we should do a podcast about how landlords look at tenant improvement credits and how they amortize that, because oftentimes people are surprised about the amount of money that landlords dish out in tenant improvement credits. credits for a creditworthy tenant who's going to be there for 5-10 years to build out the space. And those numbers keep skyrocketing, and it has really significantly affected how you're putting deals together nowadays. So I think that will be an interesting dynamic
episode, there. Yeah, for sure. And it goes into, I always think, look, the more a tenant spends on my space, the more likely they're going to stay. I mean, for example, medical, we've talked about this before, a dentist, or if you have imaging equipment, if you do physical therapy, fine, you might be able to move a lot easier. But if you're a doctor who does imaging or has, wet space, and again, I think of dentists and all the equipment that they have, that's built into the floor and everything, it's a lot harder for you to move. So you're a little bit more tied to the landlord, and same thing with a restaurant space. If you spend a lot of money on the space for FF&E, it's going to be really hard to leave. I mean, you can obviously, if things don't go well, but it becomes a little bit less an issue of and the rent and the location, and moreover, is my business making money?
Yeah, and this is why also landlords get involved with plan approvals for a build-out, because they don't want to over-customize it, in some cases, to a point where it only serves one purpose, right, and they don't see the value in the future. There are some beautiful spaces that actually, we recently leased one where the nuts and bolts of it were there. The build-out actually worked out. The separation of the offices was perfect. They all had glass doors, so it was very attractive to the people that were moving in. And so they needed a bigger conference room, so they built that out. Other than that, really all the other work was cosmetic because the layout was right. And so I think the landlord did a very good job in making sure that the layout and the configuration of that layout was going to be functional for anybody coming in to lease it out. It also helped with leasing it faster, right? Because everybody's expectation is, well, if I don't have to do much, then the timing is going to be a lot shorter, and I'm going to be able to move in, quickly. All right, this is awesome. Thank you guys for joining us. Do you have your
my fun fact.
Your fun fact? I'll tell you mine.
Go ahead.
So I was looking at this because there's a lot of news about South Florida still leading the way, especially when you look at our market economically, and we are obviously still affected, just like every other market, with the rates where they are and all the moving parts and all of that. But something that we really haven't seen is the foreign purchases really increased to the levels that they were before. And so if you look at the year end for March 24th, there are 54,300 homes that were purchased by foreign buyers. That's down 36% year over year, and it's the lowest number since they started keeping that record in 2009. However, right, and there are things, I was reading this article and they were talking about the biggest impediments is a strong dollar and limited inventory. Dollar fell 21%, and of course, the high price of properties, right? The cost of property is also a factor. And, we did have a peak in sales volume, of $153 billion in 2017, right? And, but having said all of that, Florida was still number one with over 20% of all purchases. And, I would venture to say that we have a similar percentage when it comes to commercial investment as well. But I found it interesting that Florida continues to remain to be the top market, right, for international sales. And I find it interesting that once some of these metrics shift and we start to see that increase, it again bodes well for the future of Florida and the future of South Florida.
So especially, I think, everyone's predicting that rates are going to go down, and some are predicting that they're going to be around 5.5% by the end of the year. I think that's a little optimistic, but I think that's way optimistic, but that's just going to drive up demand more. And we are seeing a huge demand for single family homes. Hopefully that doesn't surprise me.
rate reduction in September.
Yes,
so that's what everybody's waiting on. So
for sure.
Yeah.
So mine is also related to Miami real estate. In Miami, there's 2.9 million square feet of office space under construction, which is 4% of our total inventory. And we've had $400 million in sales so far in 2024, and that comes to us from Commercial Edge. And I want to give a huge shout out to our friends at Blanca Commercial, because they have been killing it with big leases. They did a 78,000 square foot lease, office lease over at Waterford Blue Lagoon. They just signed Tom Brady's family office to another, I think it's like 8,000 square feet. So good for them. It's awesome. It helps our market so much, and it just shows the strength of our market.
For sure. Yeah, and a great people over there at Blanca. Yeah. Absolutely. Great to work with.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys, for joining us. We appreciate all the feedback. We appreciate you listening in. Every once in a while, especially if you're here in the local market and you see Jennifer and I, come by and say hello. We would love to connect with you.
Yeah, and I apologize for my tongue tie, but, I was being vindictive, and that just totally threw me off. So I had to remystify commercial real estate in this episode just to stick to that word.
Guys. I got her to admit it. That's what a hell of a negotiator I am. All right, guys. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.